And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. 27 years after it was founded, then rookie MP Jean Chrétien introduced a private member's bill to change the name of an airline from Trans-Canada Airline to Air Canada. We begin today's Open Connection as MP Bachrach shares about his private member's bill.
So there are different kinds of bills. Bills are draft laws in the Canadian Parliament, and many of the bills we debate are government bills. They're bills the government puts forward. But as MPs, we have the ability to table bills ourselves. So ideas for laws that would make Canada better. And I've had a couple of opportunities to bring forward private members' bills. I tabled a private members' bill early on that dealt specifically with Haida Gwaii and their tax status when it comes to the northern residence deduction. This is a long-standing issue that we've got to get fixed. We've been pushing on it for a long time. Because it's such a remote place, the cost of living is very high. And there's something called the Northern Residence Tax Deduction, which is supposed to account for the cost of living. But for some reason, Haida Gwaii was left out of the northern zone, and so they only get half of the deduction. So that was the first private member's bill I put forward. I also put forward a private member's bill on lowering the voting age in Canada. You might remember that. And that one came forward for debate in the House. And just recently, I brought forward a private member's bill about air passenger rights. Now, this is an issue that's affected a lot of people over the past 2 years. Obviously, during the pandemic, when the air travel sector was turned upside down and people were sleeping on airport floors, so many people had their lives upended by the big airlines. Canada's supposed to have a system of air passenger protections. They call it the Air Passenger Bill of Rights, going back to 2019, but it's not working. When the Liberals brought it in, they claimed it was going to be the strongest in the world. It's been anything but. And we saw over the past Christmas holidays and certainly the last summer travel season, we saw total chaos at the airports. Flights canceled, flight delays, people sleeping on the floor in airports, missing long-awaited family vacations. And it clearly demonstrated that we need to beef up Canada's approach to air passenger protections and that we need the government to side with air passengers instead of always siding with the big airlines. So I've been working for a number of months with some of the leading consumer advocacy groups in Canada, including this organization called Air Passenger Rights, a guy, Gabor Lukács, who's really doing some phenomenal work advocating for air passengers. And I brought forward a private member's bill, and essentially saying to the Minister of Transport, everyone knows that Canada's law needs to be fixed when it comes to air passenger rights. We're going to lay out exactly how we see the fix looking, how we see the legislation being changed, in the hope that he will take those ideas and bring forward a government bill that will make those changes into law. So Bill C-327 is our private member's bill, the Strengthening Air Passenger Protection Act. And we had a press conference with a number of consumer advocates. I think it's receiving a lot of good response from the public. We've got a petition out there right now. People can go on my Facebook page. They can see a link to the petition and add their name. All this is about putting pressure on the federal government to finally put changes in place that protect air passengers, so that when you save up all your money for some big family trip, maybe to Nova Scotia to visit your distant relatives, and at the last minute the airline cancels your flight because they don't have enough pilots or they didn't maintain the aircraft, you should get compensated. Not only should you get a refund for your flight, but there's compensation that should be owed. When we look around the world, other places have stronger systems than ours. The European Union has a much stronger system. So we're trying to bring Canada up to that level and have people's backs.
Is it really that difficult to bring something like this forward to the point where it has to be a private member's bill?
The dynamic here is that we're talking about billion-dollar companies that have a lot of sway with the government. And when they have to compensate passengers because they've inconvenienced them, that costs them money. So they've put a lot of pressure on the federal government to ensure that Canada's system of air passenger protections isn't as strong as the European Union's. And so what we're doing is we're pushing back, and we're saying, you know what, after what we've seen over the past year and a half, Canadians deserve better. And hopefully it's going to fix some of the main issues with the current approach. Now, the challenges with the current approach, and I know we don't want to get into the weeds of esoteric technical policy details, but the main thing is that there's a loophole in the legislation. When we talk about flight disruptions that upend people's lives, the European system has two categories. There's ordinary disruptions and there's extraordinary disruptions. Ordinary disruptions are anything that's within the reasonable control of an airline. Things like hiring enough crew to fly the flight, maintaining the aircraft properly, all of these things. And extraordinary disruptions are things totally outside the influence of the airline. Things like major storm events, things like a recall by the airplane manufacturer. Things like, frankly, if other parties in the aviation ecosystem don't do their job, that's not the airline's fault. So if CATSA or, the airport, if their equipment fails, that's outside the influence of the airline. Now in Canada, there's a third category, which is things that are within the control of the airline but are required for safety. And this has created a big umbrella for the airlines to claim that everything falls into that category. So you've probably gotten these emails from Air Canada when your flight's canceled, and you try to get some money out of them, and they tell you, this delay or this cancellation was required for safety reasons, even though it's something that they should have been able to plan for and have some influence over.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. The tug Ingenica was towing a loaded barge along the northern coast when the tug started taking on water due to poor weather. The 3 men aboard were able to abandon ship, but only one person made it to the life raft. Let us return to the conversation as MP Bachrach shares why he's pushing to improve federal regulations.
Yeah, this was 2 years ago, February. The tugboat Ingenica left Kitimat. Left Prince Rupert. It was heading for Camano, and ran into trouble in rough weather. It was pulling a barge, and it sank, and it killed 2 of the 3 crew members, Troy Pearson and Charlie Craig. An incredibly tragic incident. And what's come out in the aftermath of that tragedy is that these smaller tugboats under 15 tons have very few regulations. They're not inspected like other larger commercial vessels are, and there's a concern from a lot of mariners that these smaller tugs are being used in ways that aren't appropriate, that aren't safe. So the Transportation Safety Board, which is the government agency that looks into accidents in the transport sector, they did an investigation, and they just recently came out with a final report. And it's pretty chilling to read it, because they essentially go through everything that's known about what happened in the incident that killed these 2 men. And there were some really egregious examples of a lack of care and due diligence by the owner of the tugboat. The safety gear on board the tugboat wasn't properly maintained. The survival suits that they found the 2 men in didn't zip up properly. The zippers hadn't been maintained. There wasn't adequate training or safety drills. And of course, the vessel itself, which was never recovered, had never been inspected. It was a 50-year-old vessel and had never received a proper safety inspection. So I've been working with the families of the 2 men that were lost and pushing to improve the federal regulations for these smaller commercial towing vessels to ensure that no other mariners lose their lives in that way, that when people go to sea, they come back to their families at the end of their shift. And there are things we can do. Unfortunately, and I've been working closely with the ILWU, which is the Longshore Union, but also represents a lot of tugboat workers on the BC coast through its Local 400, the Marine Local. And they've been flagging these concerns for years and years, that small underpowered tugboats have been used to pull loads that were too big, and that creates very unsafe conditions. That the lack of inspection meant that tugboats were going to sea that weren't seaworthy. And all of these create serious workplace safety concerns. So what we're pushing for, the Transportation Safety Board has made 4 recommendations to the federal government. We're pushing the minister to implement all 4 of those recommendations. We think that they're reasonable things that would greatly improve the safety of that industry. And they involve things like increasing the number of inspections of these vessels. Also making sure that that vessels that, and it gets a little bit technical, but there's something called a waiver for pilotage, for piloted areas like the area around Prince Rupert, that vessels that obtain that waiver, that they are seaworthy, and that there's some system for verifying that they're safe to go to sea. And so all of these recommendations we think are reasonable, and I've called on the minister personally to ensure that they all get implemented. Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't have a great track record of following the recommendations of the Transportation Safety Board. So we're going to keep up the pressure, and I've been working with Judy Carlick-Pearson, who is the widow of Troy Pearson, who was lost in the sinking, and Genevieve Craig, the mother of Charlie Craig. They're both pretty amazing women that are determined to see these changes as a legacy for mariners right up and down our coast. And I'm hopeful that we'll see these changes. But of course, like in every industry, there's always pressure to avoid more regulation. So we've got to keep sharing the message that workers shouldn't die on the job. There are things we can do to improve safety, and we owe it to them. We owe it to their families.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. The individual transferable quota system is a transferable quota of fish, meaning that an owner of a commercial fishing license can either fill the quota by fishing or sell the quota to someone else. Let us return the conversation as MP Bachrach shares how the system favors larger corporations.
Looking at the way that licenses and quotas for British Columbia fisheries are allocated, and unfortunately right now the system really favors bigger corporations. There's been a lot of corporate concentration of licenses and quota, and we know that this is not an unlimited resource. It's a precious resource. We saw what happened on the East Coast. And, in the wake of what happened to the cod fishery on the East Coast, the federal government stepped in and said, whoa. We need to make sure that the fishery is benefiting fishermen and coastal communities. And they put rules in place that essentially tried as best they could to keep out the influence of the really big corporations. One of the policies is an owner-operator policy, which states that the people that get the licenses should be the people working on the boats. They should be active fishermen, right? And the other one is a fleet separation policy, which is essentially trying to ensure that the fishing fleet and the processors are separate, so you don't get that corporate concentration. Now, there was a parliamentary committee struck to look at the West Coast fishery and learn the lessons from the East Coast fishery and try to see if there are ways that we could reform the West Coast fishery in terms of licenses and quota and ensure that the value of this fishery is staying in our communities and it's benefiting the fishermen. And they made a number of recommendations. There were over 20 recommendations. This was several years ago, 2019. And we've been pushing the government to implement those. Now, one of those recommendations is that there needs to be a moratorium on the sale and transfer of fisheries licenses and quota to foreign corporations. And right now, we have no idea who owns these licenses, because some of them are owned by companies that aren't tracked, and the government doesn't actually track the citizenship or the country of origin of these companies that are buying up licenses. So we feel really strongly that Canadian fisheries should be for the benefit of Canadians, and most of all, they should be for the benefit of the fish harvesters themselves and of our coastal communities. So right now there's a petition. Again, folks can find, I think the petition's actually now closed, so it'll be tabled in Parliament soon. But the UFAWU, the Fish Harvesters Union, has sponsored a petition directly focused on this issue of foreign ownership and calling on the Canadian government to put a moratorium in place on the transfer of licenses and quota to foreign corporations. These fish they're too precious to allow them to become this international commodity in the international economy. We should be keeping the maximum value right in our communities. And, for that matter, I think the same goes for all kinds of different resources, right? Like, for a long time, we've talked about raw log exports and the need to keep the value of our forest products here in Canada and maximize the number of jobs. It's the same idea. So when it comes to fisheries, we need good management decisions, we need good fisheries conservation, and we need to ensure that the fish that are caught in our commercial fisheries, the maximum value stays in our communities.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
In the 2019 final report from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, data shows that Indigenous people, women in particular, disappear at a higher rate than people who are non-Indigenous. In this final segment of Open Connection, MP Bachrach shares how he and MP Aaliyah Gazon are working on a red dress alert system.
You and I have talked before about one of the big things we've been fighting for in Ottawa is this national dental plan, and the idea that universal health care should cover from head to toe, right? There's no logical reason why we leave out eye care and pharmacare and dental care. And, I know when healthcare was first brought in back in the 1960s, there were some compromises made in order to get it passed. But we've long believed that project should be completed. And, we know that the health of our teeth are part of our overall health. I've never talked to anyone who denies that. And just recently, we were able to use our power in Parliament to force the government to bring in a national dental care plan that's going to help people that don't have insurance. So if you don't have dental insurance and you go to the dentist, there are a lot of people who can't afford the dental work they need. It's tremendously expensive. And so what we saw in the recent federal budget is an investment that really makes that program a reality. We've had a commitment to a phased approach. Last December, they brought in a bit of a stopgap program for kids under 12 that needed dental care, that were from families that earned less than $90,000 and didn't have insurance. That program's now in place, so if anyone out there watching this falls into that category, if you have kids under 12 that need dental care and your household income is less than $90,000 after taxes, you can apply and you can get up to $1,300 per child to get their teeth fixed. That's not a national dental program, though. That's a stopgap measure to help kids that need dental care right now. By the end of 2023, we're going to have a proper program in place that's going to cover seniors. So everyone over 65 who earns less than $90,000 and doesn't have insurance is going to get basic dental coverage. People living with disabilities are going to get dental coverage, and youth under 18. And so we're pushing to have that in place by the end of the year. The public service, the folks who are actually creating the program, the administrative side, they're all working really hard on it, really hoping we hit that milestone. because a lot of people need it. I talk to seniors all the time, and they're like, when is that program you talked about, Taylor, coming in? Because I need it. I can't hang on much longer. When you're in pain, when your teeth are falling out, when you got major issues, the longer you have to wait, the worse things get. So I'm excited about that. I think it was really the highlight of the federal budget. There's $13 billion over 5 years to make that project a reality. And we're not going to stop there. We believe that pharmacare is the next important step. The fact that in Canada you can go to a doctor and it doesn't cost you anything, but if the doctor prescribes you medication and you don't have any money, you can't actually get the prescription filled so that you can get better. That's not right. And there are millions of Canadians who aren't taking the medication they're prescribed because they can't afford it. So we're gonna work on fixing that too. But that's the one thing, and then I know we're probably running out of time. Hey, Robert, you can give me the little tug on the ear. But the last thing I'll mention is an initiative that my colleague Leah Gazan, she's the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, amazing MP, and she's brought forward an initiative that is really relevant to our region here in the Northwest. And what she's working on is something called a red dress alert. Have you heard about this? No. So we all know that the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls is something that has affected so many families here in the Northwest, right across Canada. And one of the things that I hear from the families who've been affected is that when their loved ones go missing, there isn't always the amount of attention that is deserved put on the issue in order to find their loved ones and conduct a thorough search and make the public fully aware. We have a system in Canada for Amber Alerts when children are taken or go missing. And so Leah's idea is to expand that with something called a red dress alert, so that when Indigenous women and girls are reported missing, through the system we already have in place using people's cell phones, the people in the region affected would receive an alert on their cell phone, letting them know that someone's missing, someone's family member, someone's loved one has gone missing, with a description and asking people to look out for them and to call the authorities if they have information. I think it would be a real step in the right direction, and so I've put my support behind this initiative. We were really pleased to see in the budget there was a mention of this initiative. It wasn't a commitment. They committed to prioritizing conversations about it. That's not good enough. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from people in the Northwest what they think of this idea, whether they think this is something that would make a difference. There are many things we need to do, and obviously we have the national inquiry and the calls for justice that need to be implemented. We continue to push for all of those calls to justice to be put in place. In the meantime, this is one thing that we can do to ensure that in those tragic circumstances when family members, when loved ones are reported missing, we have as many people out there looking for them as possible.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.